with the Good Time Girls, a hyper-local podcast about the quirky history of Bellingham, Washington, and the fourth corner of these United States. Even though we like to keep things close to home, these stories are no less entertaining to the masses and those who find themselves, unfortunately, outside of the PNW. We are your hosts. I am Colby.
And I'm Ren, and we are co-owners of Belling History Tours, also known as the Good Time Girls. If you want to know more about our tour business, visit our website at bellinghistory.com. Today's episode is called Gettin' Wrecked or Gettin' Shipfaced.
I like it. Yes.
Yes.
This is going to be our first shipwreck story.
Yeah, our first shipwrecks. Turns out Colby found a shipload. So we're going to be doing more episodes. Don't you fear. This is the first of many. So what do you think of when you think of shipwrecks?
I don't know. I mean, like Pirates of the Caribbean or something.
Pirates, yes.
Like buried treasure.
Booty, right?
Goonies.
The Goonies.
Titanic.
Yeah, we're going to get into that.
All the pop culture. I mean, that's basically it because I'm not really out at sea much.
I know. Right, yes. No, we are not seafaring ladies.
We live by the ocean.
We do.
We do not traverse upon it very often.
It's true. But who knew?
I mean, I would if I knew more people with boats, but I cannot afford.
We need some rich
things.
friends. Anybody out there with a boat want to take us on an adventure?
On a nice, safe adventure with lots of life preservers.
Yes, exactly. So this episode is about one of many shipwrecks, one that occurred near Lummi Island in 1875.
Yes, so to set the scene, first of all, we should acknowledge that our story takes place in the waters traditionally navigated by Coast Salish tribes such as our Lummi Nation or the Lakhtamish people, as well as the Nooksack tribe and many others who traveled the waters of the Salish Sea for millennia, since canoes were the primary transport for at least 5,000 years if you're looking at archaeological evidence and trees and all that kind of stuff. Back in the 1870s when our story takes place, there were no railroads yet, no overland roads. There, at best were some foot trails, indigenous trails. So ships were how people were getting around.
Yeah.
And with the arrival of European explorers and people coming to settle, water travel began to change. So first we have sailing vessels, of course, with the early explorers who began charting the area in the 1700s. And then by the 1830s, you started to see steam-powered transportation reaching Puget Sound. And then eventually we'll get like the Mosquito fleet of little steamships that established like regular ferry service for people traveling around in the Puget Sound area. So by 1870, you had the era of the ocean liner, you had engine technology was coming along, and steam was starting to overtake those beautiful sailing ships. But this was not the end of sail, and wind was free, coal was bulky, and took up valuable cargo space and cost money. So general cargo carriers were still being built into the 20th century, and low-value cargoes like grain and, ironically, coal to fuel the steamers were still being transported by sailing ships. So it was a mix of tall ships and steamships being used, both for shipping freight and also for passengers coming from great distances. For short distances, lots of people had little personal boats. Everybody had their little boats that they were zooming around in as well. And tall ships were mostly for shipping, taking those resources to be sold in faraway ports and lands, mostly lumber and coal, and then eventually canned fish products. So the local papers were filled with columns detailing the comings and goings of ships on Bellingham Bay and all throughout the Pacific Northwest. And some of the first things towns would build were long wharves and docks and things like that, where people could come in and out and big ships could come to port. So we mentioned on our tours that the 4 original communities here in Bellingham Bay would have been quite isolated if not for travel by boat. However, compared to most of the Western Territory, these parts were actually the least isolated as far as being a social human went, because, you had this interconnection that all these boats brought. Also bringing things like news and gossip, which, definitely seems like something we would want if I were a housewife coming out here from the Midwest. Gossip is good. That is all to say that Bellingham has a very unique and rich maritime history. Let's get into it.
So the story takes place in 1875 and talk a little bit about what's going on in the P&W, which is in the U.S. at that time. Bellingham was not yet a town. Washington was not yet a state. It was still a territory. Ulysses S. Grant was president, having been elected post-Civil War in 1869. So we're still very much in the Reconstruction era. It's the Gilded Age. It's also a severe economic recession. In 1872, the boundary dispute between the U.S. and Britain had finally settled, though, with the line being drawn through the Haro Channel, giving the San Juans to the U.S., yay! And British forces were withdrawn from the islands. You had the Northern Pacific Railroad being constructed to Tacoma using Chinese laborers, the first transcontinental railroad to the P&W. So we had our small settlements around Bellingham Bay, including Fairhaven, the original Bellingham, Seaholm, and Whatcom. And they started as 4 separate tiny towns, and then they slowly grew together. Bellingham being a little nothingness in the middle by the Chrysalis Inn and Day Spa, which quickly got incorporated into Fairhaven. And then Seaholm and Whatcom eventually became New Whatcom. And then New Whatcom and Fairhaven finally, maybe a little reluctantly, combined. And they chose the name Bellingham because it was on the Bay of Bellingham. So anyway, you've heard us say all of this before, but the town's finally united to become one big Bellingham, but it took us a little bit. So when we're here in the 1870s, 1875, we're still a little bit separated. During the 1870s here, there were only a couple of hundred non-Indigenous persons living around Bellingham Bay on donation land claims or working for the Seaholm coal mines. The Roeder sawmill had burned down in August of 1872 and hadn't been rebuilt as of yet. So the Seaholm coal mine was the primary industry and revenue for Bellingham Bay, producing around 100 tons of coal per day and employing around 100 men. So at this time, in 1875, there was just the Seaholm Wharf here on Bellingham Bay, just lonely little Seaholm Wharf, and the little coal mine, the little engine that kind of kept things going. In 1875 in Bellingham, it's still a bachelor's paradise, and many of the men are here to find their riches and make a name for themselves. So I love this quote that Colby included from Lottie Roeder Roth about what was going on here on Bellingham Bay at that time. She said, "Because eligible women were few, the young bloods of the period organized dancing parties that might travel 50 miles by canoe, as far perhaps as Port Townsend." This is like when your summer camp, the boys' camp goes to the girls' camp, right? And everybody has a dance.
I heard there's some ladies
and
down
there's
there.
some ladies over there, but this is like on a scale of 50 miles. And,
yes.
and I mean, she says eligible women who were coming were few, but I'm not sure the quality of the men that were going looking.
I don't feel bad for those eligible women.
Just saying, those poor women. They're like, oh, just let me get a clean one. But given that it was a time of social and economic turmoil and a new country being forged, things could sometimes get just a little, shall we say, desperate, which leads us to our first shipwreck story.
All right, okay. So our shipwreck du jour is the wreck of the Bark Union, which occurred on May 7th, 1875. So it's a bark, or bark. I've seen it spelled 3 different ways, including B-A-R-Q-U-E.
I like that one.
I know, it's very French. Or just bark, like a dog or a tree. Yeah. Well, I had to look up exactly what that means in terms of types of ships. And Wikipedia says, a bark, or bark, is a type of sailing vessel with 3 or more masts and main masts rigged square, and only the mizzen, which is the aftmost mast, rigged fore and aft. So that is just a bunch of fancy
that clears it up.
Sailor talk that I did watch a very enlightening YouTube video, which I will include in our show notes because I was like, what?
That's gracious of you, yeah. For all you boat nerds out there.
TLDR, it has to do with the sail plan and the rigging. And so my understanding is basically that a bark has a little more maneuverability than a full rigged ship and could use, therefore, a smaller crew and could be a little more cost effective. Cool. I've heard it was like the workhorse of the ocean.
Okay.
They were kind of like your all-purpose. Anyway, the Bark Union was described in papers as an oak ship, well built, with double knees like a whaler.
Of course, double knees, yes.
And I was like, okay, I tried to trace the history of the Bark Union, but there were multiple ships that had that name, apparently. Hard to tell which was which, but there was a whaling ship called the Bark Union. It's hard to trace. I had to know what the heck double knees means.
Yeah, do tell.
And I found an answer from the website of Hardwick Post and Beam, a timber frame company back east. I love this, so I'm going to quote. Frankly, until recently, we were not aware that ships had knees. In fact, when we first heard about ships' knees, we wondered, just where to look for them on the vessel. Above a well-turned ankle. So they said, no wonder we were puzzled. Ships no longer have knees, but they used to. The rounded hulls of the great wooden ships of the 18th and 19th century were strengthened against the pounding of the seas by a series of braces fashioned from the naturally curved limbs, called knees, of live oak trees. But then you get, in the mid-19th century, iron, and so live oak trees were no longer in demand. So now you know. Knees.
Hey.
So the Bark Union was loaded with 575 tons of coal up at Nanaimo, British Columbia in Canada. And then it was going to take that coal to San Francisco, but it was puttering on by nearby here when it struck a sunken reef 12 miles from the town of Seaholm.
That's us.
Yeah, so recall the main drag of Seaholm was basically where State Street is today. So if you're over there by that little roundabout, that's kind of near where the wharf would have been.
Yeah.
So that's the town of Seaholm and the coal mine over yonder there. The boat floated off with the tide and then sank in 10 fathoms of water. So a fathom, I had to remind myself,
good to know.
A unit of length equal to 6 feet, so about 60 feet, which doesn't seem super deep.
Okay.
Seems pretty shallow for the ocean.
Okay.
60 feet is like 4 cars stacked end on end, or like a bowling lane.
Yeah, that's not crazy.
No.
It's not like the Titanic.
No, so it's not like you have to go down into deep space of the ocean.
Yeah, okay. All right, so the ship did sink, but no lives were lost. On board, we had the captain, John M. Lindell, first and second mates, a cook, a steward, and 6 seamen. Okay, where the Bark Union struck was said to be, quote, near Clark's Island, which we believe to be referencing Clark Island, which is a very small island between Lummi and Orcas Island. Clark Island is a 55-acre island, and the entire thing is a state park. Clark Island Marine State Park, which has 2 picnicking sites and 15 primitive campsites. The name of the island, it is said, was given by Charles Wilkes of the Wilkes Expedition of 1838 and 1842 for John Clark, a midshipman who had been killed during the War of 1812's Battle of Lake Erie. Before any of these names, there were undoubtedly indigenous names for the island, but we were not able to track down that information, unfortunately. There's some very cool maps with some Salish names, and the Watka Museum has a cool map, the People of Sea and Cedar exhibit, that documents a lot of local indigenous place names, but unfortunately, Little Clark Island wasn't included on any that we came across. So, news of the wreck of the Bark Union was published in various papers in 1875. In a dispatch from Seaholm to the San Francisco newspapers, it was said, quote, she hung on the reef for 4 or 5 hours when, the tide changing, she drifted off and sank in about 10 fathoms of water. Apparently, the announcement of the wreck and it being a total loss was a great surprise because of the unusually safe character of the locality where she was sunk. Why would a strong little ship with such good little knees sink?
In such a safe spot.
Yeah, that's interesting. A second dispatch from Seaholm reported that there would be an auction there of items from the Bark Union, quote, as she now lies sunk in 10 fathoms of water near Clark's Island, including a large number of sails, which were saved before she went down. The underwater portion of the wreck of the Bark Union was reported as having been sold to Samuel D. Howe of LaConner for $60, and the sails, ropes, etc., were purchased by William P. Jones, superintendent of the Bellingham Bay Coal Company. So apparently Sam Howe then brought a guy to visit the wreck and make an estimate of the cost to raise it, and he reported, quote, the vessel is in a safe condition and thinks it will pay well to raise her. So this is a time and place where stuff, material goods, were at a premium. As we mentioned before, we are in a time of recession, so nothing goes to waste. They salvaged everything they could, both before and after the ship went down. That said, with the technology of the times, retrieving stuff from the ocean floor was not exactly easy. The ship owners might not want to deal with it, and so they would just auction off the rights to the wreckage to anyone willing to try and retrieve it. And this is going to come back.
Yes, it is. A few months after the wreck was reported, this was July of 1875, it was in the news that Captain John M. Lindell and chief mate Ellis L. Dean were both arrested in San Francisco at the insistence of the insurance companies for willfully wrecking the vessel. And did you know this was a crime punishable by death?
That's pretty fucked up. That should tell you something about
I had
boats at the time.
No idea.
Yeah,
I
that's
was quite shocked.
fucking crazy.
So, yeah, under the statute of the United States, section 5365, which at the time stated, every person who on the high seas willfully and corruptly casts away or otherwise destroys any vessel of which he is owner, in whole or in part, with intent to prejudice any person that may underwrite any policy of insurance therefore, or any merchant that may have goods thereon, or any owner of such vessel, shall suffer death.
Damn.
And it wasn't just an owner who might hang. As the following section also stated, every person not being an owner, who on the high seas willfully and corruptly casts away or otherwise destroys any vessel to which he belongs, being the property of any citizen, shall suffer death.
Yeah, that's the important part. You will die.
Right. And so then I learned some more fun new facts and words. The first word is scuttling, which I'd kind of heard of before.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah.
According to Wikipedia, a ship is scuttled when its crew deliberately sinks it. So there are various reasons that you might consider it legitimate to scuttle a ship, like to avoid being captured by enemies or providing an artificial reef for marine life. But under Admiralty law or maritime law, it is called barratry. So here's your other word.
Yeah.
When an act of gross misconduct committed by a master or crew of a vessel resulting in damage to the vessel or its cargo, which includes desertion, illegal scuttling, etc.
Okay.
So until 1888, barratry was a capital offense, meaning death. Death penalty in the U.S. However, it was said that juries routinely refused to convict people of the crime, even if guilt was obvious, because most people just didn't really agree that it should be punishable by death.
Yeah, I think it was like, there's a couple people that we would kind of like to kill.
Right.
But it's not so important for everyone. We just want to like reserve that right.
So the crew of the Bark Union likely knew this, I would guess. But it seems also like it would still be nerve-wracking to be arrested for a crime punishable by death, even if you hoped the jury was going to
just crossing your fingers.
acquit you. So after being arrested, the mate, Ellis Dean, apparently made a confession. And he said that the captain had approached him with plans to destroy the vessel. So he's blaming it all on the captain. And he said the captain said the ship's owner knew of the scheme. And the mate was like, I didn't want to go along with it, but, you know, they really pressured me. And, of course, he would get a cut of the money. And, of course, the Captain Lindell, denied those charges. Yeah. As one would.
I probably would. So we found some articles reporting on the trial that elaborated on the chief mate's story. The chief mate, Ellis Dean, said he had known Captain Lindell for around 4.5 years. Note, Ellis Dean was allegedly British, or maybe Scottish, but was raised in Massachusetts. Captain Lindell was Scandinavian, or maybe German, as best we can tell. So Ellis Dean quoted the captain as having said to him, "This is a good place to plumper. I am ruined if I do not have this bloody bark. Leave this. Oh, I'm ruined if I do not. Should I? Let me get an accent. Yeah. Let's see.
Do your best British accent.
Well, it's Lindell, so he would have been. Oh, but it's Dean saying this.
I mean, it looks like a British accent.
This is where
they
we
say bloody a lot.
They say bloody. So Ellis Dean quoted the captain as having said to him, "This is a good place to plumper. I'm ruined if I do not leave this bloody bark. Now is the only chance." Oh, Jesus. I'm sorry, everyone. Dean also quoted the captain as having said he wished to, quote, lose the bloody old box. That was pretty good.
That was a good one.
I'm going to claim that one. So we're trying to figure out if the Scandinavian captain was using British slang or if it was Dean's own embellishment, as you can tell.
I know, I'm like, those slang words definitely sound British.
I love that, but there's probably a lot of mixed in.
Yeah, they're sailors.
That's fascinating. We can do a whole podcast on that. Another paper quoted Dean as confessing that when they were 3 days out on their voyage on the bark Union, the captain had told him he wished he could lose the damned old box. Note, damned was not spelled out, but written with dashes in the newspaper. We're still keeping it classy. Dean reported he had asked the captain what interest it would be to him if he lost the vessel, and he replied that it would be a good thing. Again, according to Dean, the captain said it would be first rate if she were loaded with coal. Dean said the captain had repeatedly spoken of good places on the voyage to plump. Note on plump as a verb, perhaps more familiar to us as an adjective, obviously, when we're having full, round, usually pleasing form. But as a verb, it can mean to drop, sink, or come in contact suddenly or heavily. Think of plumping up a pillow, but also apparently sinking a ship. We are learning all the things. The word of the day is
so many words.
We're not maritime historians.
Scuttle it, plump it.
Scuttling and plumping. I love this.
All right, so we have an extensive quote here from the newspaper, again quoting First Mate Ellis Dean. Okay, quote, "We were not running..." I'm not going to do an accent, I can't.
Come on, Colby.
No.
You just embarrassed myself.
This is too long.
Oh, yeah.
"We were not running in the usual part of the channel, but near the rocky shore. She was from 1/8 to 1/4 of a mile therefrom. This was about 10 or 12 o'clock. The captain then went below and left me in charge. I remained until 5 the next morning. At this hour he came up and seemed to be very cross. He uttered a few oaths. And in about 20 minutes he said, 'Call all hands and get the anchor ready.' He pointed from the window a good place to plump her."
Okay.
"We were about a mile off from it. I went forward, called all hands, and remained at my post. We veered off again and put over toward the mainland, running about 1.5 miles. We were then heading toward Sandy Point. We tacked ship and stood with the wind for Clark's Island. He then again swore and said, 'God damn my luck! Now is the only chance. If I don't lose her, I am ruined.'"
Just saying this all out loud? I don't know.
"We struck on the ledge, and it was between 250 and 300 yards of the island. This was between 11 and 12 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of May. She remained in that position until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The stores and all available goods were taken out. We threw out the anchor to make fast to the ledge. At 5 o'clock she sank in 10 fathoms of water. We remained in the vicinity until the next morning." Blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
So another witness that took the stand was a sailor named John Anderson, a Swede, who testified that on the Thursday night after leaving Departure Bay, the captain had said the bark was leaking very badly and would be, quote, "a coffin for somebody."
Ooh.
So basically Anderson backed up Dean's story, saying the captain had been talking up the likelihood of the vessel being lost. But then you got witnesses for the defense, which included Peter Smith, second mate of the bark Union, who testified that proper efforts had been made to save the boat, and that the captain had indicated that he didn't believe the vessel was even insured. He testified that he did not see or hear anything while on board to indicate there was any plan to wreck the ship, and furthermore, he said he overheard the captain say to the first officer, Dean, "I cannot trust you on deck for 5 minutes." So that threw a little suspicion then on Dean, upon whose confession the whole case is essentially hinging. So you had another witness, James Belcher, the 46-year-old cook and steward, who had been 33 years at sea, so that means since he was 13.
Jeez.
Belcher also testified he had never heard the captain or mate say anything about the sinking of the vessel. He also stated he had been angry about not being paid and had taunted the captain about casting away his vessel and saying that he wished he could see him in irons.
Jeez.
So I liked that bit.
Okay. He's a little, you know what? Most chefs are a little cranky. I think James kind of lives up to that.
Also, they're the most underpaid probably on the ship.
Probably.
Charles Smith, produce merchant, testified that Ellis Dean told him the wreck was as pure as an accident as ever was in the world. So Dean's saying different things to different people, it sounds like. So 2 other sea captains took the stand and testified to the danger of the area where the boat had sunk. in contrast to what we'd heard before about it being so safe.
Exactly.
But some of his buddies got up there and were like, hey, can be a very dangerous spot. The current can be swift. There have been wrecks there. One of the captains said he lost a vessel there himself.
Mm-hmm.
Then they looked at the contract with the owner of the ship, whose name was Mr. Beetle. And so they analyzed that, and it seemed to indicate there was not any real, motive. There wasn't like a huge lucrative amount of money to be gotten if they deliberately sunk the vessel. So that really kind of sealed the deal. The boat was apparently not insured for full value. So Beetle testified he had not agreed with the captain to plan to wreck the ship. So that was looking pretty good for them.
Yeah, captain's looking good, but oh man. Ellis Dean is going down. He's going to get jumped in an alley somewhere.
Right?
So the outcome of the trial was that Captain Lindell was acquitted on the charges of willfully wrecking the bark Union off Bellingham Bay. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Opinions were that the case for the prosecution had not been made out beyond a reasonable doubt. So no one was hung for plumping the bloody old box in the end. Meanwhile, in the P&W and later in July, it was reported that Samuel D. Howe had feared that he would be unable to raise the wrecked bark, but still felt he had made a good speculation in buying her. Again, so we're in 1875. It can't have been easy to get the big old ship off the ocean floor. So we're going to discuss this in detail. Stay tuned. Sam Howe never raised the ship and then apparently sold it off to another prospector. Enter Amos O. Benjamin, who purchased the wreck in 1880. Benjamin intended to raise the bark and convert her to a steam craft. I think it's just fascinating that, it's still salvageable to make into a boat.
They recycled boats so much.
So crazy.
Every shipwreck story. I mean, even the steamboats on Lake Whatcom, they would burn, and they would just salvage whatever they could and make a new boat out of it. Yeah.
Cool. So, spoiler alert, Amos Benjamin did not get around to it in his lifetime, but later his son, William Benjamin, did eventually salvage the wreck. So we need to talk about the Benjamins. Amos Oscar Benjamin was the pioneer of deep sea diving and salvage in the P&W. Amos Oscar Benjamin was born in 1853 in Oneida County, New York. He fought in the Civil War, got married, and had made his way west over the years, and had undertaken a lot of occupations along the way, including that of removing buildings. So he got into the wrecking business on land first, probably figured out how to salvage and resell a lot of materials in the process. And then the family homesteaded in Nebraska until grasshoppers destroyed all their crops. Wow. Whereafter they abandoned that property and made their way to Seattle, where no grasshoppers would be seen, arriving in 1878. Benjamin again went into the business of building removal as well as piloting steamboats. And over the years, he was the owner of more than 30 steamboats, many of which he had bought disabled and then repaired and sold for profit. So apparently he successfully raised a train locomotive from underwater twice after many had tried and failed. Once from the Puyallup River and once from the bay at Tacoma. And thus he discovered the lucrative niche for retrieving stuff from underwater, at which he was apparently talented. So Benjamin started working with the undersea divers and even learning to dive himself. This is mind-boggling. Deep sea diving in ye olden days.
Okay, let's back up a minute because I never really thought about why deep sea diving was invented. But basically, it had a lot to do with the fact that ships sank with a lot of valuable shit in them.
I feel like we should have known.
Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious, but I hadn't really thought about it.
No, for real.
So it turns out the history of diving is super interesting, and I definitely dove deep down that shipwreck hole.
Boo. Boo, yes.
A lot of information that I'm going to tell you about comes from an article on the brief history of diving online at divetraining.com. It is anything but brief. Okay, but I found it quite fascinating, but I'm going to try to distill it down to the most relevant parts. So if you go all the way back, you got free diving, which is just people holding their breath and being able to go underwater for a long time. Probably just foraging for food or maybe pearls and oysters, but also for retrieving stuff that fell out of ships or sank with ships. There was a thriving salvage industry in the Mediterranean. We're talking before Christ here. This is
wow,
real old. Cool. Greece, Mesopotamia, but really all over the world. So I loved this little story. The very first diving apparatus is credited to an Egyptian named Hasan ul-Gawassin, who was in the Turkish Navy during the Third Crusade. I'm like, they had a Navy. Yeah. This guy constructed a device made from a bellows and weighted with stones that would allow him to remain like partly submerged below the surface and swim past the Christians.
Cool.
And so there's written accounts by him of his horror at seeing under the water hundreds of bodies strewn on the seafloor, serving as a feast for eels, octopus, and crabs, which then unfortunately became his own fate, as he was eventually spotted and shot with bows and arrows.
Damn it.
By crusaders. So then you had the diving bells, which is the earliest type of equipment for underwater work. So this was discussed by Aristotle and reportedly used by Alexander the Great. So again, this is really old.
Yeah.
And it was just like a big bell. So like open at the bottom. And somehow it works. If you lower it straight down in the water in such a way the air gets trapped up in the container. And so the divers can like pop up in there and just get some air.
Yeah, have you ever seen a butter bell?
Yes.
Put the butter in there and you stick it down and then it just seals it with the water. But the water doesn't touch the butter.
That makes so much sense.
Right?
I never thought about a butter bell. Thanks, friend.
Yes.
So people start figuring out all this kinds of physics about pressure underwater. That led to the invention of more sophisticated diving tech. This English guy named John Lethbridge, he salvaged a lot of stuff for the Dutch East India Company and is credited as the forerunner of commercial divers. So, but interestingly, I thought diving technology kind of got a lot of crossover with firefighting technology. Because, spoiler, guess what? When it's smoky as fuck, it's hard to breathe.
Yeah. You gotta have fresh air coming in. That makes sense.
It's also hard to breathe in water, you know. Also, I guess coal mining stuff, where another place where it's hard to breathe. So some of that technology crossed over, and you got these early diving helmets made by these guys, the Dean brothers. And so this is like a copper helmet with a flexible kind of collar and suit. Yeah. And there'd be this leather hose attached to the rear of the helmet to supply the air, pumped again using a bellows. I'm like, okay. There's a little picture there. Guy's looking like a weird alien robot.
Very steampunk vibes. In the 1830s, August Seeby improved the Dean brothers' helmet design and produced a helmet fitted to a full-length watertight canvas diving suit, which connected to an air pump on the surface. The suit also included an exhaust valve in the helmet to allow air to escape without air getting in. So, turns out that it's real good to have that one-way exhaust valve. We have to read this bit from A Brief History of Diving. Early diving helmets did not have non-return valves. This meant that if a hose was severed, the high-pressure air surrounding the diver rapidly and with incredible force evacuated the helmet. At even a modest depth, the tremendous negative pressure created by the escaping air caused an extreme and often life-threatening squeeze on the diver. This is exactly what happened to Private John Williams. Fortunately, however, even though his face and neck were swollen and livid, his eyeballs, capillaries ruptured, and blood was flowing from his ears and mouth, Williams survived. But he never returned to diving. I don't blame him. In extreme cases, the negative pressure caused by a severed air hose could actually suck flesh and soft tissues up into the pipe and much of the diver's body up into the helmet. Stories abound, in fact, among old-time commercial divers, where so much of a diver was sucked into his helmet that it was buried in place of a coffin. It just made a little gushy puddle of him. I don't like it.
This reminds me of the submersible thing.
I know.
It's pressure. I do not like
pressure is insane. Yeah, that's really, really interesting to read about, but holy crap, nightmares. We'll just leave the treasure down there. I'm good.
I know, I'm good.
You guys take pictures. Tell me all about it.
No, thanks. So Seeby's design, which had the exhaust valve.
Yes, we like Seeby. Genius.
That was handy. So that became effectively the first standard diving dress.
I like that they called it a dress.
I know. And then listen to this terminology. The original standard diving equipment consisted of a copper helmet, or if you're British, a bonnet.
Of course, a copper bonnet.
And that clamped to a copper breastplate, or corselet.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
Corselet,
so
I love that.
Transferred the weight to the diver soldiers. And then the whole thing clamped with a rubber gasket to make a watertight seal.
Fancy.
I know. I was surprised that the first scuba self-contained underwater breathing apparatus was patented in 1878. That seems real early.
It does.
By Henry Fluess of London, and that eliminated the need for surface supply air, so no bellows.
The two dudes up there with the bellows, yeah.
So anyway, there's lots more interesting diving history. It's real steampunk shit, but you've got the idea. We're going to get back to the Benjamins in the 1880s in the PNW, and they've got some primitive diving gear.
Okay.
So in an 1888 article in the Tacoma Ledger, it described the operation of Amos O. Benjamin and a diver, James Moore, and how they were going to the bottom to recover a boiler from a steamship. And this is their description. They said the diver was encased in a loosely fitting rubber suit with an iron helmet bolted to rings at the shoulders. The air supply tube entered at the forehead, and a valve through which the air already breathed could pass out was at the back of the helmet. The casing for the head contained 2 round glass-covered spaces in front and also one on each side. The soles of the diver's shoes were heavily weighted with lead. A ladder 42 feet long extended down from the side of the wharf into the water. On the wharf was a double-cylinder air pump, operated continually by 2 men. Oh. And to this pump, the air supply was fastened. But this was clearly not scuba, because we got the bellows.
Right,
guys,
yeah, so we're still quite there. Yeah. But we did have the valve.
The valve.
Yeah.
This sounds like the CB design.
Okay.
So, in 1897, Amos Benjamin incorporated the Alaska Company, specifically for raising sunken vessels, and his sons entered the business with him. And I found this amazing ad, which we'll put in our show notes. It has this little drawing of the, quote, bolt helmet used by the divers. And it says, Alaska Company Incorporated, A.O. Benjamin, President and Manager, Divers and Wreckers, buys, sells, and trades steamers, engines, boilers, pumps, wenches, etc., etc. Diving gear, captain stock, dredging, towing, estimates on heavy work.
Yeah.
And the bolt helmet, I found out historically these deep sea helmets were described by the number of bolts used to like clamp them down.
Okay.
So you might say like, I've got a 2-bolt helmet or whatever. I don't know.
Like
whatever.
Make them
bolts.
More, like you go down
I
farther?
don't know. There was a lot of details and my eyes glassed over and I was like, you can Google that if you're interested.
Fair enough. Fair. Another fun, quick aside story about Captain Benjamin. In 1899, Captain Benjamin, along with Seattle physician Alexander DeSoto, formed the Seattle Benevolent Society, and they took the hulk of an old steamship, the Idaho, and moored it at the foot of Jackson Street, where it served as a waterfront emergency hospital. After it began to leak in 1906, it was moved and propped up on piles near the Yesler building, and taken out of service entirely by 1909. It was then buried under fill dirt. A historical marker, though, is at that spot today at the Washington Street public boat landing between the Bainbridge Island Ferry and Pier 48.
I love that, because I'd heard that story before about the old steamship hospital, but usually you just hear the doctor's name mentioned and not the guy who actually probably had the steamship and did all the dirty work.
Yeah, exactly. Had all
Benjamin.
The tools to get it up there. I love boats being used. It's like we had a little boat used as a prison or
the
jail.
The jail boat.
The jail boat up here, and then a hospital, though. That's pretty cool.
I just love that they just repurposed and recycled everything.
Yeah. All right, so back to the Bark Union, which we last knew was still sitting at the bottom of the ocean near Clark's Island, west of Lummi Island. Fast forward to October 1917. We're still down there when, according to the Friday Harbor Journal, an attempt to salvage the Bark Union was going to be made by William S. Benjamin, the son of the previously discussed Amos O. Benjamin, the pioneer of PNW Marine Salvage. We mentioned before that Amos bought the wreck in 1880 with plans to raise it and convert it to a steamship, but he hadn't gotten around to it yet. Maybe it was because they were having trouble finding it, exactly as the article reported that his son William had been looking for the wreck on and off for years and had finally discovered it again. The news had become public when he presented one of the copper pumps from the Union in Seattle a week previous. So this is over 40 years after the bark went down, so it's not really a wonder that they lost it. And it was believed at the time to set a record in being, as far as was known, the most ancient salvage operation on the Pacific coast. Who knows?
They're still cold down there.
They're still cold down there. The article said he began salvage operations with his small gas boat, the Igloo, then purchased an old steamer freighter from the Port Blakely Mill Company called the Seattle Spirit to carry on the work. The plan was to use a large clamshell dipper to bring the coal to the surface. Okay, yes, so we're after the coal. The article described how Benjamin had discovered all the iron in the old bark had been eaten away by salt water, the anchor reduced to almost nothing, and the chains practically gone. But that the copper and coal were, quote, as good as the day the ship went down, showing absolutely no signs of deterioration. All of the upper works had disappeared long before.
So it's unclear what the problem was, but it doesn't seem like they salvaged it. So I don't know what happened, if they ran out of funding or they had equipment problems or what. But suffice to say, it doesn't seem like the ship got salvaged in 1917. And then Amos Benjamin, our salvage pioneer, he passed away in 1919, but his son William kept on diving, and he had now knew at least the location.
Where it was, yeah.
So he didn't return for the wreck of the Bark Union until August of 1932.
Oh, man.
So that's another whole 15 years later. So almost 60 years since the ship sank. And at that time, the Bellingham Herald announced that Frank Wright, president of the Carlisle Packing Company, and W.S. Benjamin, Seattle deep-sea diver, would again go after that coal, using the packing company's powerboat, the Carlisle II, then the clamshell shovel, and a scow.
Okay, again.
And I'm guessing that this has to do with Frank Wright of the Carlisle Packing Company being like, I'll fund this.
Yeah, I've got some money.
Yeah. So this was not the first time William Benjamin had done diving work in and around Bellingham, however. In the 1916 Herald, there was an article describing him as the human submarine.
I love that.
He had been hired at that time to inspect the municipal water main intake pipe in Lake Whatcom, which he reported was in good condition, and also commented on the hundreds of bass down there.
Important.
And at that time, they described his suit. Everyone was so excited about the diver suits. Like, the papers were always, like, describing them in great detail. That they said it was being weighed down with 150 pounds of lead.
So scary.
And offsetting the air inside his suit, explaining it was necessary to release some of the air pressure when coming near the surface, or the pressure inside his suit would shoot him into the air when he reached the surface.
Or suck him into his helmet. Blah!
So that was 1916, just before he had found the wreck of the Bark Union. But funny, I thought the city talked shortly after that about wanting to purchase its own diver's suit, because then they wouldn't have to pay for some out-of-town diver to come and look at the water pipe, right?
I don't know about
I don't know if they ever did that,
This
though.
seems like a bad way to save money.
Whose job is that gonna be?
Who you putting in there?
So William Benjamin also worked for the canneries in the area. I think he would do a lot of, repairing fish traps and inspecting them and things like that.
Yeah, seems like a pretty lucrative gig.
So he probably had already worked for Frank Wright of the Carlisle Packing Company. And so the Carlisle Cannery Packing Company, that had been built in 1896. It was over on the very outside of Lummi Island. So it would have been looking right out at the site of the shipwreck near Clark's Island.
Crazy.
And Frank Wright's house, so not Frank Lloyd Wright, just to be clear, but Frank Wright of the cannery, his house was out there, which it stood out there till 1989 when I guess it burned.
Damn.
And there's nothing really left of the Carlisle cannery. There's an old abandoned cement foundation at Village Point, I guess, is really all that's left. Anyway.
Quick little jaunt into diving technology of the 1930s. There's a YouTube video, and according to the notes, the location of the events in this film is unknown. But from the description, it says, the full title reads, The Deep One. He's the inventor of a new armored deep-sea diving suit with which it should be possible to search the ocean bed 100 fathoms deep. Yes, let's watch it.
Do you want to...
Like an old-timey little movie. Oh, cool. Oh, no.
Look at this thing.
Look at his little robot arms. This is insane.
It looks like the heaviest.
This is amazing. You all must go find it. Wow.
We will link to this.
Speed on the uptake.
Fast forward, they just bring him out.
So they bring him out. He went in. Now he's dangling from a rope in his giant robot costume that probably weighs like thousands of pounds.
I know.
Oh god, now they're like unbolting him to get him out of it.
So that's it. It's short and sweet, but that's 1930 just to put
was trippy.
Put us in.
I don't know. I like the rubber.
I don't think our guy's using that type of
maybe
suit.
that's to go deeper.
It is.
Yeah.
And he says, that guy in the video, he's like, I intend to use this to go salvaging shipwrecks.
Super duper deep.
Yeah.
Cool. Back to the successful salvage, finally, of 1932. So at this time in 1932, the coal salvage operation was successful. Yay! W.S. Benjamin and Wright were scooping tons of coal from the wreck site with their equipment. They delivered 100 tons of coal to the Bellingham Builders Supply Company, which displayed samples of the coal in its commercial street windows. The quality of the coal was said to be unimpaired by its long submersion in the sea, though some of it was encrusted with clam shells. They finally got their money. They also reportedly found a section of one of the masts, a piece of the anchor chain, and a piece of decking ridden with teredo holes. What are teredo holes, you ask? Here's another good word. Those are wormholes, or specifically clam holes. I guess Teredo nivalis is actually a species of saltwater clam, but it is called a shipworm due to its worm-like appearance.
Also, the paper did not report on this in Bellingham, but apparently they may have also found a cannon. Now, this is a little, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I did find a 1951 Seattle Daily Times article that was reporting on an interesting historical cannon found by W.S. Benjamin, so our Benjamin guy, and he had died in 1943, and so it was his son, William Benjamin Jr.
Oh, another one.
Yeah, he'd inherited all these treasures that his dad had obviously salvaged from various shipwrecks. So I don't know if this really came from the Union. There was 2 cannons discussed in this article, and they were more interested in another one, but they did also mention the family owns another gun brought up in 1936 while salvaging coal from the Bark Union. And I haven't been able to find out much about either cannon. They were really excited about the other one because they believed that it was designed and cast by Paul Revere.
What the?
Nice. And that one got donated to the Washington State Historical Museum. And I did a quick search of their archives catalog online and did not find anything on either cannon. Cannons are fascinating to me also, and there was a bunch of cannons around Bellingham, but turns out a lot of old cannons got recycled for scrap during World War II.
Subsequent wars, yeah.
Maybe one of those cannons is out there somewhere. If anyone knows.
So freaking fascinating.
Okay, this is a bit of an update here, because I thought that after the coal was salvaged from the Bark Union in the 1930s, that was more or less the end of the story. However, I found a few more little interesting tidbits that got me very excited to bring our story about the Bark Union right on up to today. So in September of 1963, the Herald reported that divers discovered the wreck of the Bark Union. Again, the same Bark Union sunk off Clark Island in 1875. So 2 Bellingham guys, well, one was an orthodontist and one was a dentist, Dr. Robert Foster and Dr. Jansen Hornbeek, were apparently diving for funsies in their spare time, and they went out looking and found the wreck of the old vessel. So this article says that the ship was built for a whaler in 1847 at New Bedford, Massachusetts. So there's another clue. I don't know where they got that information, but again, this is a very old ship that may likely have been a whaler. For the article, they interview also Bellingham diver Art Hook, who said he dove to look at the wreck in the 1920s. And he also mentioned that a, quote, local firm unloaded the coal and sold it. So I noticed Art Hook, basically the go-to diver in these years after the city had been talking about buying a diving suit. He did a lot of the diving, and he must have known William Benjamin. There just weren't that many other people doing diving, and one would guess they would talk. Benjamin was a good 20 years Art's senior. At any rate, amazing name, a real Captain Hook. So Hook commented that it looked just like a pile of barnacles. He apparently removed part of the mast and had given a section of it to Harbor Master Harry Lewis, who in turn mounted it and gave it to the Bellingham Yacht Club. Gonna try to see if that's still around. Yacht Club people, shout out. Foster and Hornbeak found a few pieces of coal, some copper, siding, and bolts, a large hinge, and some other rusty trinkets. But you know what no one had found? The ship's anchor. This became the obsession of a young local lad and friends, specifically Mr. Lee Hand, who was a Sea Scout, and also in the 60s, plans for a second high school for the city of Bellingham were underway. So fast forward to 1969, the school is newly opened. The Sea Scouts have been looking for the anchor for years and finally had found it. According to an article in the Herald by Jack Carver, quote, rusted with 94 years in salt water and covered with barnacles, a 1,000-pound anchor from the sunken American Bark Union was raised from its grave on a reef off Clark Island and placed permanently in front of Seaholm High School. So this blew my mind because I went to high school there in the late 80s, and I walked past this anchor daily for many years and never knew that it was actually an old anchor. You know, I just figured it was some kind of sculpture, someone's art project or something like that, because we were the Seaholm Mariners. So Lee Hand, the Sea Scout, he had encouraged the other scouts to join in on this search for this wreck, and they spent 3 years searching under the skipper Don White Sr. on the ship Discovery until they found it. So there wasn't much else left of the ship, and they had to search the deeper waters next to the reef where the ship was, and they finally found the anchor by tracing a long line of barnacles that turned out to be the chain. So they lashed 3 55-gallon drums together with cable and then basically used the buoyancy power of that to raise this anchor, which just blows my mind. So other Sea Scouts involved were Terry Falstrom, Steve White, and Rick Swan. They spent 3 weeks cleaning it and preparing a concrete slab to display it on, and Seaholm teacher Don White Jr. served as an advisor for the project. So this was really also very exciting because we happened to have a connection to the Whites through our guide, good time girl, Sarah Fenstemacher. And so we had a chance to chat with Steve White and talk to him about what he remembered about this whole affair.
Okay, so Lee got excited and thought that'd be pretty cool. And so we go out looking for this anchor. So kind of knew where the barge was, but then when you're down there and rocky stuff trying to find an anchor that's sitting on the bottom.
Sure.
Finally found kind of a piece of chain. So then you try to follow that as best you can.
Oh my God.
A tank of air would last an hour, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, so you don't get to stay down there that long. The deeper you are, the shorter that time is. So that's what took a long time to actually find the anchor. Once it was found, then put a buoy on it, marked where it was at. So, how do you get the anchor up once it was located? And Lee put all this together and did research. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, he talks to an engineer, and you have to float an anchor that's designed to sink. And then how do you secure it when it floats? Kind of describes it in there. There was 3 55-gallon drums.
Right.
Lashed them together really tight. Did all this on the surface. And then you sink them so you can get them down there to the
So you got to put weights on the barrels to sink them.
Tie the barrels to the anchor. Now you're down there working in depth, and you've got to make sure everything is going to hold. You don't want knots coming. Of course, we were pretty good at knots because that's part of our training.
Tying knots, sailor's knots.
So got everything all lashed up to the barrels. Now you have to fill them full of air. So how do you do that? Well, take a big bottle of oxygen. We drop that down. You take the bung out of it, they call it. Stick a hose in air and fill one up. We know about the bung holes from the distillery.
Fill
the barrel with air, and then it starts getting buoyant. Now the problem is, as air rises from that depth, it expands. So as it expands, it becomes more buoyant, and it starts picking up speed, going up.
Go shooting
and
out.
it can go, and everything can come apart when it comes flying out of the surface. You have to control that because there's a bunch of kids down there scuba diving. So we went down, and each diver had a specific job to do. And remember, you don't have a lot of time down there before you run out of air. Get the thing so it starts to go up it comes. And it worked. Once it gets to the surface, then you unhook that, It sounds easy, but it's today they wouldn't let young kids do this kind of stuff.
High school.
Somebody get hurt. Well, yeah, maybe. Once I got to the surface, then, and it's solid steel, so it's pretty good weight. It'd be more than 300, but I don't know it'd be 1,000.
So I was excited that it's still there. I'm gonna go up and take a picture with it.
Anyway, to me, as being part of it, it was always a fun adventure because we had lots of different adventures, but that was something that came up and was actually presented and has hung around for quite a while. So, it was pretty exciting to do it, not realizing the history behind it when we were kids. So it was just more of an adventure.
Sure, exactly.
Go ahead and do.
So this is just a small snippet of our hour-plus conversation with Steve White, but just to give you a sample, we may release a longer version later as bonus content because we talked to Steve about all kinds of fascinating and interesting things. Although there's a lot of banging and noise because we were interviewing Steve at Gruff Brewery, which is owned by his son Eric White. And it was great to hear a firsthand account of someone bringing up this anchor. So I was also very excited because I knew that the school had recently they tore down the 1960s Seaholm High School buildings and replaced it with a brand new Seaholm High School. So I was worried that the anchor may have been, put into a storage shed somewhere, but I did find that the anchor is there in front of the school. So yay! Go Mariners!
Just last winter, another shipwreck from 1875 was found in the Nia Bay area off the peninsula. In December of 2022, it was announced that a modern-day salvage company found the wreck of the steamship SS Pacific. And this is reported by the King 5 News of Seattle that the ship was traveling from Seattle to San Francisco in November of 1875 when it collided with a large sailing ship in the dark of night. This was just months after the wreck of the Union that we've been talking about. They said it had a major impact on the Northwest. It was the first ship that was carrying passengers on a regularly scheduled service between Seattle and San Francisco. And that was a quote from underwater recovery expert Jeff Hummel. Estimates put the number of passengers at 325 people, but there were probably more, and only 2 people survived. Also on board were tons of oats and hops and hides, 230 tons of coal, and a substantial amount of gold. The King 5 article says that Jeff Hummel has been exploring Northwest waters since the 80s, and his love of history has driven him to search for the Pacific. After years of painstaking research, Hummel said, "Eventually I found a commercial fisherman who brought up some old coal, and just by strange circumstance, he happened to still have the piece, so I was able to get it chemically analyzed by a laboratory up in Alberta. It was a match to the ship, and he and his team began to close in. 12 missions later, they've identified the wreck." So yeah, Hummel secured the legal exclusive salvage rights and is gearing up for the recovery and preservation of the ship. Expected, obviously, to take several years. We're learning this shit takes a long time. Their plans include building a local museum to display parts of the ship and personal items to tell the stories of the people on board, which is pretty incredible. That's such a hard-fought little piece of history to bring back up.
Yeah, and that one's kind of more like on a Titanic level where you had a lot of
personal belongings.
People on board.
Hummel said that the state of preservation of this wreck is on par with any of the greatest shipwreck finds in the world. Pretty crazy. So yeah, keep your eyes out for that. So we probably got to talk about, it's worth mentioning the recent Titanic accident, or just the Titanic in general, because I think that's the one.
And I think it's interesting how these guys, there's just these salvage people. If you find the thing, then you got to apply for the rights.
Yeah, it's not just yours.
It.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
But if you get to it first and you get all your paperwork
and shit together,
you get to go
exclusive rights.
Yeah.
But with older ones, people kind of fighting over the rights to things,
And then there's a lot of, fraughtness and feelings about it being
it's
basically
it's
a burial site. It's a bunch of dead people.
Yeah, exactly. And these aren't terribly old, so still have families probably, thinking about it.
It's going to be a few generations out, but yeah.
Well, Titanic, it's still pretty damn intense, So yeah, with that said, among the most famous wreck salvages is, of course, the Titanic. Much like the ship in our story, the search for Titanic was a lengthy one. Many folks came forward with ideas to find the ship, including releasing a bunch of fancy magnets that would be helplessly pulled towards the wreckage for the explorers to follow and then find.
Weird.
I know. Or bringing the wreckage to the surface using thousands of ping pong balls.
Oh.
Which they did not account for the pressure that would just squash the little ping pong balls. We're still figuring things out. Much of that hype, though, was, of course, the fantastic nature of the wreck. But just as we've been talking about, is also the value of the contents still on the ocean floor. A lot of expensive contents. People, that loved ones are looking for. So, as you may have heard, though, there was a recent tragedy at the site of the wreckage when a submersible company that had been offering the 1% commercial dives to the site since 2021 imploded.
Right, so there's a whole nother thing. Let's do tourism to sites of wrecks.
Right. You got to be rich, but let's do tourism. And it's tourism to space, too, right? That sounds familiar. Mm-hmm. So though many official oceanic science institutions have thrown their hat in the ring for both the locating and the diving, much of the search has been by these independent, rich eccentrics who in some cases have damaged the archaeological site for good.
I guess you have to be a special kind of personality type or something. It's like climbing Mount Everest. All those people that go and do that and half of them die and the poor Sherpas. And I'm just like, what? It doesn't do it for me, but I guess that's a thing some people need in their lives. And I am going to warn that in some of our future episodes, if we get to them, because we have a lot of shipwrecks, but there will be, this one today was a nice easy one because it didn't
Nobody
died. Deaths.
Not one person died.
That's kind of unusual.
Yeah. I mean, I can't believe we had somewhat like the guy didn't get hung.
I know, no one
got
hung.
acquitted.
It was a nice late shipwreck.
We didn't talk about any racist shenanigans.
Well, we could get there. You want to know why they didn't know how many people exactly died on that shipwreck?
Damn it, Colby.
That's why.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. All right, I don't have any takeaways. Other than that, I don't want to get sucked up into my fucking helmet or dissolved into a little lump at the bottom of the ocean. No, thank you.
I find this all very interesting, and I like reading about these other people that go. Not for me.
Seems like a lot. That's going to wrap up this episode. We are going to do another episode, another shipwreck episode.
Yeah.
So
we'll do at least one more. We're going to do one more
this
to
season.
Round out the season, and then we'll probably have to put some in our back pocket for later.
Yeah, you guys are going to get bored if we do too many.
Shipwrecks.
Yeah, well, Colby will get tired of shipwrecks, so we gotta give her a break too.
We'll come back. then.
We want to thank you all for listening, as usual, to Belling History with the Good Time Girls.
Well, hey there, mama, where'd you go? You gotta reap just what you sow. That's too bad, too bad. To that old time, the old man hits without bad weather. Put on the side, they were sewn together. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
Do subscribe or review our podcast on your favorite podcast platforms. Like us on all the social medias. Check out our tours and events. Read our show notes and blog. All of that at bellinghistory.com.
Ah, blue, love you, red, blue, love you, blue. Most of the time, look at so see blue. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. I lost my hat. I lost my brim. I look like crows just swinging on a limb. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
And we'd like to thank Devin Champlin and the late great Lucas Hicks for the use of Gallus Brothers' song Too Bad West Coast Blues. You can find the Gallus Brothers tunes on Bandcamp, and you can also find Devin Champlin's music on Bandcamp and at Champlin Guitars in Bellingham.
Lost my hat, lost my brim, looking like a crow's nest swinging from a limb. That's too bad, too bad. Well, I got no bugging, I got no smokes. I look like Grandpap and all of his folks. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
Tune in next time for more Belling History.
Thank you. Thanks.